I suppose the beginning must be told slowly because the way a man's life narrows down in old age never happens in one violent stroke, but in a series of smaller withdrawals, each of which feels almost natural at the time, until suddenly you look up and realize the horizon has shrunk to the size of a kitchen window and a single chair at the dining table. I am 72 years old, a widower for nearly a decade, and though I tell people in the neighborhood that I am doing fine on my own, I am not sure I have truly believed that for a long while. My house, once warm with voices, now carries silence like dust on every shelf, and the clock in the living room, a wedding gift from my wife's parents, seems to tick louder with every year, filling in for the conversations that are no longer there. When I rise in the morning, I move carefully, feeling the weight in my joints, listening to the faint protest of knees that once carried me through long workdays without a second thought. I brew my own coffee, the way my wife used to, though it never tastes the same, and I eat a small breakfast while looking through a newspaper that no longer carries the world, only the proof that a world still exists outside my window. My daughter, the only one I have, lives across town with her husband and their 2 children, who are not really children anymore but young adults with lives that make no room for an old man's presence. I raised her with my wife as the center of our little universe, believing as parents do that the bond between father and daughter was a thread so tightly woven that time, distance, or resentment could never break it. I was wrong about that, though the realization did not come all at once. At first, it was only small changes. A missed phone call returned hours later, an invitation to dinner delayed, a birthday card that carried her signature but not a note written by her hand. I told myself she was busy, that her job in insurance demanded everything from her, that the pressures of marriage and raising teenagers excused the silences that kept lengthening. My wife, before she passed, used to caution me against letting those silences grow too wide, but I was the kind of man who believed that patience would repair everything if only you waited long enough. Patience, as I learned, can sometimes be nothing more than a disguise for denial. The evenings are the hardest when the shadows gather and the house groans as if remembering footsteps that no longer cross its floors. I sit at my table with a plate of food I cooked for myself, and I find that the taste is dulled not by lack of seasoning but by the absence of conversation. Once, that same table was crowded with family, my daughter laughing with her cousins, my wife passing dishes she had prepared with such care, and me carving the meat as though presiding over a ritual that confirmed we belonged to one another. Those nights seemed endless then, the kind of moments you never think to treasure because you assume they will always return. Now I understand they were fragile, and that they left without warning, like a flock of birds startled into the air. What remains is only the echo, the shell of the ritual, the table standing solid but stripped of the warmth it once gathered. My hands tremble sometimes, not dramatically, just enough for the spoon to rattle against the edge of a cup or the newspaper to flutter when I hold it. Doctors call it an essential tremor, nothing deadly but persistent. A reminder that age is carving its mark into me whether I resist or not. I try not to let it define me, but I know others notice, especially my daughter, who has a way of looking at my hands as if they were proof of something she has long suspected. That I am no longer reliable, that I am sliding into a weakness she has no patience for. I remember the first time she mentioned it, her tone sharp, almost irritated, as though my body's failure was a choice I had made to inconvenience her. That look has stayed with me, because it said more than words. It said that she no longer saw me as the man who built the house she grew up in, or the one who sacrificed decades behind a desk to pay her tuition, but only as someone whose shaking hands might spill a drink on her carefully set table. Still, I go when she calls, because a father clings to whatever fragments of family are offered, even when they cut like glass. When she invites me to dinner, I iron my shirt, polish my shoes, and remind myself to sit up straight, to speak clearly, to prove that I still belong. The walk from my front door to her car is short, but it feels like a performance, as though I must demonstrate to the neighborhood that I am still capable, still deserving of being escorted to a family gathering. In her house, everything gleams with modern polish, appliances that talk to one another, furniture chosen for its sleekness rather than comfort, photographs of smiling faces on vacation where I was never invited. I take my seat at the edge of their large oak table, the same table I once helped choose and pay for when they moved in, believing at the time that it meant inclusion, that it meant I would always have a place there. Yet, every time I sit, I feel more like a guest tolerated than a father welcomed. I watch my grandchildren speak in quick, careless sentences about schools and friends I will never meet, their eyes drifting toward their phones as though my presence were a static interruption in the program of their lives. My son-in-law asks polite questions, never listening to the answers, and my daughter hurries the conversation along, anxious for me not to linger on stories that to her ears must sound like relics of an irrelevant past. I smile when expected, laugh when cued, and keep my thoughts mostly to myself, because I have learned that silence prevents arguments, though it also erases the chance of being remembered. The meal passes in a blur of flavors that fail to reach me, because my mind is caught on the shifting ground beneath my chair. The knowledge that each dinner could be the last one offered, that my invitation depends less on love than on convenience or obligation, and yet, despite all of this, I still carry the stubborn hope that something will turn, that my daughter will look at me and remember not the burden, but the father who once carried her on his shoulders through crowded parades, who stayed up late to finish her science project, who stood proudly in the audience at her graduation with tears hidden behind his glasses. That hope is what keeps me walking into her house when she calls, even though each time I leave I feel smaller, as though pieces of me have been left behind at the table, never to be returned. The cruelest part of aging is not the weakening of the body, but the gradual discovery that your role in the family story has shifted from central to marginal, and that no one announces when the change occurs. You just wake up one evening and realize that you have become the character who waits quietly in the background, spoken to only when necessary, expected to be grateful for crumbs of attention. It was on one of those evenings when the sky outside still held on to the last pale streaks of daylight and the air carried the faint smell of freshly cut grass that my daughter insisted I come over for dinner. She called me in the morning, her voice brisk, almost impatient, as though she had fitted me into her schedule the way one fits in an errand, and though part of me hesitated, knowing how these gatherings usually left me feeling diminished, I agreed. Without much thought, because saying no would have sounded too much like surrender. I arrived on time, as I always do, wearing the gray trousers I reserve for such occasions and the dark jacket that belonged to my better days. And when she opened the door, she gave me a quick embrace, not the kind that lingers, but the kind that clears an obligation, then ushered me inside toward the table already set for 4. The kitchen smelled of roasted chicken and garlic, and for a moment I let the scent pull me back to Sundays when my wife used to cook with music playing in the background, her humming weaving into the clatter of pots, and the house felt alive in a way this one, no matter how polished, never quite does. The oak table stood in the center of their dining room, polished to a shine that reflected the light from the chandelier, and I noticed immediately how carefully everything was arranged. Plates aligned, silverware gleaming, glasses set at equal. Distances, as if precision itself carried moral weight. I lowered myself into the chair at the far end, the place they always reserved for me. Not quite at the head, not quite in the middle, a location that seemed symbolic of my place in their lives, visible but not central, included but never fully embraced. My son-in-law sat across from me, already scrolling through his phone until my daughter nudged him, and the grandchildren drifted in with their distracted energy, offering me brief nods before slipping into their seats. Conversation started lightly, about the weather, about a neighbor's new car, about the twins' upcoming exams, but I could feel an undercurrent, the way one senses a storm waiting behind a cloudless sky. When the food was served, my daughter placed a generous helping on my plate without asking what I wanted, and I accepted it silently, telling myself it was kindness, though it felt more like management. I reached for the glass of water in front of me, and that was when it happened. My hand trembled, only slightly, but enough for the rim of the glass to tap against the plate and for the table to give a faint rattle. It was nothing. A small sound, the kind that would pass unnoticed in another home, yet here it froze the air. My daughter's eyes flicked to my hand, then to the glass, and with a sharpness that cut through the room, she said, "Dad, stop shaking the table." She didn't whisper it, didn't soften it, but delivered it in the same tone she might use with an unruly child caught misbehaving at a formal gathering. For a moment no one spoke. My son-in-law looked down at his plate with a smirk he tried to hide. The grandchildren exchanged glances that carried both amusement and embarrassment, and I felt the heat rise in my face as though I had been caught in some shameful act. I steadied the glass with both hands, willing the tremor to quiet, though the more I tried, the worse it seemed, and in that silence I became acutely aware of every sound. The clink of utensils, the shifting of chairs, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room. My daughter, perhaps realizing her words had hung too harshly in the air, forced a smile and returned to cutting her food, but the moment had already done its damage. I felt as though the entire evening had shifted, that every gesture of mine would now be scrutinized, every movement weighed against their unspoken expectation that I remain invisible, flawless, incapable of disrupting their carefully arranged order. What she had said was simple, almost trivial, yet the sting of it lodged deeper than I wanted to admit, because it revealed not only her impatience but her perception of me, not as her father, but as an inconvenience, a trembling relic who threatened to disturb the smooth surface of her well-ordered life. As the meal continued, I found myself withdrawing into silence, pushing food around my plate more than eating it, listening to their conversation unfold around me without finding any place to enter. The grandchildren laughed at jokes I didn't understand, jokes built from references to shows and people beyond my reach, and my daughter occasionally glanced at me as though checking to make sure I hadn't tipped anything over. I tried to remember when last I had been spoken to with warmth at this table, when my presence had been welcomed rather than tolerated, but the memories blurred with the passing years, and I began to wonder whether those earlier times had been real, or whether I had simply chosen to believe in them because the alternative was too painful. I noticed, too, that the oak table, the one she had scolded me for shaking, was the same table I had once bought for them as a housewarming gift, chosen with care for its sturdiness and promise of lasting through generations. To see it now turned against me, as though it were a stage on which my decline was displayed, filled me with a bitterness I struggled to swallow with each mouthful of food. The evening stretched on, the conversation circling through matters of money, school, and plans for the future, all subjects in which I was either irrelevant or gently excluded. My daughter spoke with an authority that suggested she had assumed not only the role of hostess but of guardian, as though my mere existence required oversight, as though the man who once guided her through every uncertain step of her childhood had now become someone to be managed. Her earlier remark, sharp and public, had stripped away the thin veneer of respect that remained, and though she likely thought little of it afterward, I could not escape its weight. It was not just a correction of behavior, it was a declaration, a reminder that in her eyes I no longer controlled even the tremor of my own body, that the place at her table was conditional on my ability to remain still, quiet, and unobtrusive. By the time dessert was brought out, I could feel the lines of tension etched into my face, and though I forced myself to smile when offered a slice of pie, the taste was like ash in my mouth. I excused myself early, claiming fatigue, and as I walked out into the night, the cool air hit me with a clarity I had not felt in years. That single sentence, delivered without thought, had pierced through layers of patience and denial I had built around myself, and I knew something had shifted permanently. A man can endure neglect, can excuse coldness, can forgive silence, but there comes a moment when a simple remark, unguarded and cruel in its casualness, reveals the truth that has been festering all along. My daughter had not only silenced me, she had declared me small, fragile, unworthy of being seen as the man I once was. And as I walked down the empty street toward my own house, I understood with an ache in my chest that this was not just another dinner, not just another evening endured. It was the moment the balance tipped, the spark that would ignite what came next. When I returned home that night, the silence of my own house did not greet me as comfort, but as a verdict, a confirmation that whatever dignity I once carried into my daughter's home had been stripped away with a single command across the table. I sat in the living room without turning on the lights, staring at the dark outline of the clock against the wall, listening to its steady tick as if it were mocking me, keeping score of the seconds I had lost. Sleep did not come easily, and when it finally did, it was restless, filled with dreams in which I was again at the table, my hand shaking, the glasses rattling, my daughter's voice cutting through the laughter, and the faces around me turning away, unwilling to acknowledge me except as a nuisance. In the morning, when I rose to make my coffee, I noticed how heavily my body moved, as though the weight of that moment had settled into my bones. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that perhaps I had been too sensitive, that perhaps my daughter had spoken out of habit or stress, not malice, but the echo of her tone would not leave me. It had been too sharp, too practiced, as if she had said it many times before in her head, waiting for the chance to make it real. The following week brought another invitation, and though every instinct in me urged caution, I accepted, because the fear of being excluded altogether outweighed the certainty of discomfort. When I arrived, I noticed small things I had not seen before, or perhaps had refused to notice. My chair had been shifted slightly farther from the center of the table, as though to create more space between me and the others. The glass of water set at my place was a plastic tumbler rather than the crystal goblets used by the rest of them, and when I reached for the breadbasket, my daughter quickly intercepted it, slicing a piece herself and placing it on my plate with the kind of smile people use when managing children. My hands trembled again. Of course they did. They always tremble. And though I managed to steady myself before anything clattered, I caught the glance she exchanged with her husband, a look of quiet confirmation, like two people tallying evidence for a case they were building silently. The food was good, though tasteless to me, because every bite carried with it the awareness that I was no longer part of the ease of this home. I had become the disruption they tolerated because appearances required it. The real escalation came when the conversation shifted, as it often did, to matters of the house. My daughter began speaking about her own home, the mortgage, the repairs, the rising taxes, and then, with a quick glance at me, she asked whether I had ever considered selling mine. She said it lightly, as if she were asking about the weather, but her husband leaned forward in his chair with a kind of anticipation that gave away the weight behind the words. "It's really too big for you alone, Dad," she said, her fork tracing little circles on her plate. "You know how much work a house requires, and with your health it might be easier to move somewhere smaller. A condo, maybe, or an assisted living community where they could help with meals and maintenance." I tried to laugh it off, saying that I managed well enough that the house was my home and I intended to stay there as long as I could, but my son-in-law pressed the point. He began to list the financial benefits, the way the sale could free me from worry, the opportunities to simplify my life, and while he spoke, his eyes gleamed with a calculation he barely bothered to hide. My grandchildren chimed in as though rehearsed, saying that it would be nice if I lived closer to them, though the tone of their voices carried no warmth, only the hollow enthusiasm of people repeating what they had been told to say. I felt the walls of that dining room closing in on me, the table becoming not a place of gathering but a tribunal where my independence was on trial. Each word they spoke stripped me further of the illusion that I was there as a father or grandfather. I was there as a possession, an asset to be transferred, a house to be liquidated. The sting of my daughter's earlier rebuke about the shaking table now revealed its true purpose. It was not just impatience, it was preparation, the slow erosion of my authority so that when the time came to move against me, I would already feel diminished, already believe myself incapable. I looked at the oak table again, at its broad surface polished to perfection, and realized with a start that I had once bought that very table for them, believing I was helping them build a home, never imagining it would become the stage for my own diminishment. The conversation did not stop with vague suggestions. My daughter excused herself for a moment and returned with a folder, placing it gently by her plate as though it were nothing more than the evening's menu. She did not open it, not yet, but the presence of it was loud enough. I knew without asking what it contained. Drafts of documents, proposals, perhaps even a power of attorney ready for my signature. My son-in-law casually remarked about how complicated legal matters could be for someone of my age, and how it was wise to prepare things in advance to avoid confusion later. I nodded without committing, my stomach turning as I chewed the tasteless chicken, and inside me a quiet anger began to stir. For years I had tolerated their distance, their coldness, their condescension, telling myself that family was worth the sacrifice. But this was no longer about emotional neglect. This was about erasure, about stripping me of the little autonomy I had left, about turning my life into a set of assets they could divide at their convenience. That night when I returned home, I stood for a long time in my own kitchen, running my hand across the worn wood of my table, a table scratched by decades of use, by meals shared with my wife and daughter when laughter still filled the room. It was not polished, it was not perfect, but it was mine, and it bore the marks of a life lived honestly. I thought of the oak table at my daughter's house, shining and cold, and I realized how fitting it was that she would scold me for shaking it. She wanted stability, appearance, perfection, and my humanity, with all its flaws and tremors, had no place. There. That realization was the true escalation. Not her words, not the folder, but the understanding that the bond I had clung to was already broken, that she no longer saw me as family but as liability. I poured myself a glass of water, my hand trembling as it always does, and for the first time I did not fight it. I let the glass rattle against the table, let the sound fill the room, and told myself that if my presence was to be reduced to an inconvenience, then at least I would not apologize for it. The patience that had defined me for so long was beginning to thin, and though I did not yet know what form it would take, I could feel a line being drawn inside me, a line that once crossed would never allow me to return to the quiet endurance of before. The weeks that followed carried with them a heaviness that never seemed to lift, a sense that every interaction with my daughter was now weighted with suspicion and hidden intent, as if the air itself between us had thickened with something unsaid, yet unmistakable. I tried to carry on with my routines, brewing my morning coffee, walking slowly through the quiet neighborhood, stopping at the park to watch the ducks scatter across the water, but even in those small acts I felt a tremor of unease, a knowledge that the balance of my life was shifting beneath my feet. My daughter called more often than before, yet the calls were not for conversation but for questions disguised as concern, whether I had remembered to pay my bills, whether I was taking my medication properly, whether I was feeling confused at times. Each inquiry, delivered in a tone of practiced sympathy, carried an undercurrent of accusation, as though she were building a case file on me, laying the groundwork for some decision that had already been made. I answered politely, holding my voice steady, but once I hung up the phone I found myself pacing the rooms of my house, whispering aloud just to hear my own clarity, reassuring myself that I had not yet lost the thread of who I was. The turning point came during another dinner, one I almost refused but attended out of the same stubborn hope that perhaps this time would be different, that perhaps the edge of her voice would soften. The table looked as it always did, precise and gleaming, but there was an energy in the room that set my nerves on edge before I had even taken my seat. My grandchildren were quieter than usual, their eyes darting toward their mother as though waiting for cues, and my son-in-law's politeness seemed even more rehearsed than normal. We began eating, the conversation moving slowly, and then, almost casually, my daughter shifted it toward finances again. She asked about my utility bills, whether I found them difficult to manage, whether I thought it made sense for her to help with the payments. Before I could answer, she leaned forward and said she and her husband had been talking, and that they believed it was time for me to consider signing a power of attorney, just to make things easier, just to avoid complications down the road. She slid the folder she had hinted at before across the table toward me, opening it this time so that the papers inside were plainly visible, their black print stark against the white pages, with my name typed neatly in spaces waiting to be signed. The silence that followed was louder than any shout. My fork froze midway between plate and mouth, my hand trembling not from illness but from the force of the realization. It was not speculation anymore, not an unspoken agenda I suspected but could not prove. It was here, in front of me, in black and white, her attempt to claim control not only of my house but of my life. She smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes, assuring me that it was only a precaution, that it was for my benefit, that I would thank her later when things became simpler. My son-in-law added that many families did this, that it was common sense, and my grandchildren looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge the narrative. I stared at the papers, at the lines waiting for my signature, and I felt something inside me crack, a long-held belief shattering in an instant. For years I had excused her distance, forgiven her coldness, endured her corrections. But now the truth stood in front of me undeniable. I was no longer her father in her eyes, no longer the man who had raised her, but merely an obstacle between her and the control she craved. I did not sign, of course, but I also did not raise my voice. Instead, I pushed the folder gently back across the table, my face calm, though my chest was burning. I told her I would think about it, that I needed time, and she nodded as though indulging me, her smile fixed, her eyes already betraying impatience. The rest of the meal passed in a blur, the food tasteless, the conversation meaningless, and when I excused myself early, the relief I felt stepping into the night air was mixed with a profound sorrow, because I knew in that moment that something had ended. The illusion that I still had a place at that table, that I was still seen as family, dissolved completely. The papers had revealed the truth in its rawest form. They were not waiting for me to falter. They were preparing to push me. The crisis was not simply the threat of losing my house or my savings. It was the discovery that my daughter, the child I had once believed would carry my memory with love, now looked at me and saw only property to be managed, a problem to be solved, a signature waiting to be obtained. That night, back in my own house, I walked from room to room, touching the walls, the furniture, the photographs still hanging where my wife had placed them years ago, and I felt both rage and grief in equal measure. Every corner of the house whispered of sacrifice, of hours spent working, of dreams shared, and yet to her it was nothing but real estate, numbers on a page, leverage to be transferred once my resistance weakened. I realized then that the battle ahead would not be about paperwork alone. It would be about memory, about dignity, about the right to remain myself in the face of their determination to reduce me to less than I was. The midpoint of my story had arrived, and I felt its weight settle fully. There would be no going back, no pretending, no return to patience. What they had placed in front of me was more than a legal document. It was the proof that my daughter no longer loved me as a father, but only measured me as an obstacle. And with that realization came the quiet certainty that whatever happened next, I could no longer remain silent, because silence had already cost me too much. The days after the folder appeared on the table became a kind of rehearsal for a verdict that had not yet been delivered, as though my daughter and her husband, emboldened by my refusal to sign, decided that if they could not secure my consent, through civility, they would begin tightening the noose of humiliation until resistance itself seemed foolish. I began to notice the change immediately in the tone of her calls. which grew less like inquiries and more like interrogations, as though she were collecting evidence. She asked whether I had misplaced things, whether I had locked the front door at night, whether I had taken a fall, and each time she reminded me of the tremor in my hands, the way I sometimes repeated myself, the hours I spent alone in silence. Her questions were not questions at all. They were statements disguised in the form of concern, meant to paint a picture of decline, to build a portrait of incapacity. At first I tried to answer with humor, brushing away her insinuations with the patience I had learned across decades of fatherhood. But there comes a point where humor turns bitter in the mouth, and I began instead to keep my responses short, knowing that no explanation I offered would alter the story she had already decided to tell. When she invited me again for dinner, something in me hesitated more strongly than before, a warning bell that told me to decline, to protect myself from another evening of subtle erosion. Yet the pull of family is a strange thing. It is stronger than reason, heavier than self-preservation, and even as I knew I would suffer, I found myself dressing in my best jacket and walking toward her house with the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, she would set aside her schemes and remember that I was her father. The evening began with the familiar stiffness, the same polished table and carefully measured smiles, but there was a new element now, a thinly veiled impatience as though they no longer cared to hide the contempt behind courtesy. My son-in-law asked pointed questions about my finances, whether I was keeping up with mortgage payments, whether I had considered the burden my property would place on me in the years to come. My daughter joined in, not with kindness but with a sharp efficiency that made it clear the conversation was rehearsed. She spoke of long-term care, of responsibility, of protecting assets before it's too late. She did not say the words directly, but the meaning was plain. She and her husband were preparing to take control whether I liked it or not. It was during dessert that the cruelty sharpened into something unmistakable. One of the grandchildren, perhaps without thinking or perhaps repeating something overheard, laughed and said, "Mom says Grandpa forgets everything anyway." The room fell silent for a moment, my daughter's face tightening as though she had not meant for the remark to escape so directly. But then she recovered with a shrug and a laugh, saying lightly, "Oh, kids repeat everything, don't they?" My son-in-law chuckled. The grandchildren looked away uncomfortably, and I sat frozen, the words ringing in my ears with more force than if she had shouted them at me. She had told them, her children, that I was forgetful, that my memory was slipping, that I was fading into irrelevance. In that moment, I saw how carefully she had prepared her story, not only to me, but to everyone around her, planting the seeds of doubt so that when the time came to strip me of authority, no one would question it. I realized that the humiliation at the table was not accidental, it was deliberate, a calculated erosion of my credibility so that, when she finally moved to declare me incapable, she would not stand alone. The betrayal of hearing those words through the mouth of my grandchild cut deeper than anything she herself could have said, because it proved that she was willing to rewrite me in the eyes of the very people I had once carried on my shoulders, willing to destroy not only my autonomy but my memory in the lineage of the family. After dinner, I excused myself quickly, unable to bear the weight of their gazes, and on the walk home I felt as though the very ground beneath me was crumbling. It was not only that my daughter sought to control my house and my finances. It was that she was willing to dismantle my identity, to recast me in the role of a senile, trembling man who no longer knew his own mind. The thought of it kept me awake for nights, pacing the floor of my kitchen, whispering aloud entire passages of poetry I remembered from my youth, recalling details of old clients from my days as an accountant, rehearsing dates and names and numbers, simply to reassure myself that I was still intact. I was not losing my mind. I knew it with clarity. But to them, truth did not matter. Perception was enough. If enough people believed me frail, forgetful, incapable, then the truth of my clarity would vanish beneath the weight of their narrative. The escalation reached its cruelest form during a family outing that my daughter insisted upon one Saturday. She said it would be good for me to join them at a restaurant by the water, a place she described as lively, cheerful, filled with people. I suspected the invitation carried another purpose, but again, against reason, I accepted. When we arrived, I felt immediately out of place. The restaurant was crowded with polished couples, young families, the hum of conversation rising like static, and I was seated at the edge of the table, as though positioned deliberately apart from their circle. The waiter brought menus, and when I asked for steak, my daughter overrode me with a smile, telling him I would have steamed fish, no salt, because of his health. I protested, but she silenced me with a hand on my arm and a look that said not to embarrass her. My son-in-law laughed and told the waiter to bring only water for me, not wine, because alcohol and medication don't mix. I had no such restrictions, yet they spoke of me as though I were absent, as though my presence was only a body occupying space. The humiliation was sharpened by the couple seated at the next table, acquaintances of theirs, to whom my daughter introduced me not as her father, but as someone she was taking care of now. She told them, smiling sweetly, that I sometimes forgot, things that I needed gentle reminders. And she said it all with such practiced ease that the couple nodded in sympathy, looking at me not as a man, but as an affliction. I could not eat the fish. It tasted of saltless water and shame. When my daughter told the story of how I had nearly set fire to the kitchen last month by leaving the stove on, I felt my chest tighten with both rage and despair. The story was a fabrication. I had not been in her kitchen for months, but she told it with such detail, such casual authority, that even I felt a flicker of doubt, as though memory itself could be rewritten if spoken with enough conviction. I tried to object, to defend myself, but she silenced me again, laughing lightly, saying, "See? He doesn't remember." The couple nodded, indulgent, sympathetic, their eyes sliding past me as if I were already gone. It was in that moment, more than any other, that I understood the full scope of her plan. This was not about my comfort or even about convenience. This was about constructing a narrative of incapacity so convincing that when she finally moved to strip me of legal authority, no one would question it. The public humiliation was part of the design, each lie a brick in the wall she was building around me, a wall that would one day stand between me and my own name. That night, when I returned home, I did not cry, though the ache in my chest pressed hard enough to break me. Instead, I sat at my table staring at the photographs of my wife on the wall, and I whispered aloud to her as though she were still alive. I told her what had happened, told her how our daughter spoke of me, how she erased me piece by piece. I asked her what I had done wrong, how the child we had raised together with such care had become a stranger capable of such coldness. There was no answer, of course, only the silence of the house, but in that silence a decision began to form. The patience that had defined me, the willingness to endure humiliation for the sake of family was cracking. I realized that if I remained passive, if I allowed her to continue writing this false version of me, soon even I would begin to believe it. The escalation had reached its peak. She was no longer content to control my property. She wanted to control my identity, and if I did not resist, if I did not reclaim the narrative of my own life, then everything I had lived for, all the sacrifices, all the work, all the memories, would vanish beneath the lie she had chosen to tell. I went to bed that night with a calmness I had not felt in years, not because I was at peace, but because I knew what must come. The second escalation had shown me the depth of her betrayal, and now I understood the stakes with clarity. It was no longer about keeping my seat at her table. It was about building a table of my own, one that could not be shaken by her voice, one that would carry the truth of who I was long after her lies had faded into dust. The night of the breaking point arrived without fanfare, an ordinary invitation delivered with the same briskness as always. my daughter insisting that I come because the family needed to eat together more often. I knew before I set foot inside her house that the evening would not be ordinary, for the atmosphere of these gatherings had long since shifted from family ritual to tribunal, but I accepted anyway, compelled by a mixture of dread and resolve. This time, however, I was not walking in with the quiet hope of reconciliation. I was walking into a battlefield, and though I had no sword to raise, I carried with me the weight of truth, sharpened into something I had never dared to wield before. The table gleamed as it always did, every glass and plate positioned with exacting care, and I took my seat at the edge, aware that my daughter had arranged the chairs so that I was once again isolated, the lone defendant at the end of their polished oak arena. My son-in-law busied himself with his wine, swirling it as though preparing for judgment, and my grandchildren murmured half-hearted greetings before turning their eyes back to their phones. Only my daughter spoke with intention, filling the room with a practiced authority that made it clear the script had already been written. Dinner began with corrections, as always. She told me to eat more slowly, to be careful with the knife, to take smaller bites as if I were a frail patient under her supervision. When I reached for the glass of water, my hand trembled, and the rim tapped lightly against the plate. The sound was faint, barely more than a whisper, yet she seized upon it as though it were a crime. "Dad, stop shaking the table," she snapped, her voice slicing through the hum of the chandelier's faint buzz. The words echoed the first rebuke weeks ago, but this time they carried more weight, more authority, as if she were declaring not just irritation, but ownership. My son-in-law chuckled into his glass. My grandchildren looked down quickly to hide their smiles, and in that moment I understood with clarity that they no longer saw me as a man, but as a performance, a spectacle of decline staged for their own, reassurance that they were right to strip me of dignity. The humiliation should have broken me, as it had so many times before, but instead it ignited something deeper, a fire that had smoldered beneath the ashes of patience for too long. I steadied my glass with both hands, set it deliberately on the table, and lifted my eyes to hers. The silence was heavy, thick enough to press against the walls, and for the first time in years I did not look away. I spoke slowly, not with anger, but with the measured calm of a man who has nothing left to lose. "This table you accuse me of shaking," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands, "was bought with my money, chosen by me as a gift when you moved into this house. And the house itself, the walls you sit so proudly inside, the mortgage you so carefully pay, was secured with my down payment. You speak as though I am a burden at this table, but remember this. Without me, there would be no table, and there would be no house. And tomorrow, both the table and the house will no longer belong to you." For a moment, the room was utterly still, my words hanging in the air like a blade suspended over their heads. My daughter's fork froze midway between plate and mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. My son-in-law lowered his glass, the smirk draining from his face, and the grandchildren shifted uneasily, suddenly aware that the performance had turned. I had not raised my voice, yet the force of those sentences shook them more than any shout could have, because in them lay the truth they had ignored for too long. I still held power, and I had chosen to wield it. My daughter was the first to recover, though her voice trembled with a panic she tried to disguise as anger. "What are you talking about, Dad?" she demanded, her face tightening into the mask she wore when cornered. I kept my gaze steady, unflinching. "I am talking about the documents I signed when you begged me for help with this house. I am talking about the deed that lists me as a co-owner, an equal shareholder in the property you now call yours. You thought you could treat me as if I were already gone, as if my hands shaking meant my mind had gone with them. But you miscalculated. Tomorrow morning, I will speak to my lawyer, and this house will be listed for sale. Every brick, every window, every polished inch of this oak table will go to the market, and you will be forced to live not in the comfort you take for granted, but in the knowledge that your contempt has cost you the very roof over your head. The silence that followed was broken only by the faint clatter of a knife slipping from my son-in-law's grip onto the plate. My daughter's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing as though words had abandoned her, and the grandchildren looked from her to me, their expression shifting from amusement to shock. The power in the room had shifted, and for the first time in years it rested with me. I rose slowly from my chair, the tremor in my hands visible but irrelevant now, because the strength of my voice carried what my body no longer could. I placed my napkin gently on the table, straightened my jacket, and looked at each of them in turn. You wanted me silent, invisible, diminished to the point of erasure. You wanted me to sign away not only my house but my dignity, to let you tell the world I was too feeble to remember my own name. But tonight I tell you this. I am not gone. I am not the shadow you tried to cast me into. I am the man who built this life you so casually dismiss, and I will not let you steal it while I still draw breath. My daughter began to protest, her words a tangle of excuses and denials, but I raised my hand, the tremor shaking through the air, like a drumbeat, and silenced her. No more, I said, the finality of it resonating in the stunned quiet. No more lies, no more humiliations, no more pretending that cruelty is concern. Tonight, you learn that a father may bend under the weight of years, but he does not break. The room remained frozen as I stepped away from the table, the sound of my footsteps echoing against the polished floor. I did not look back as I reached the door, for I knew that what had been said could never be unsaid, that the balance of power in our family had shifted forever. For years I had carried the shame of their contempt, absorbing it in silence, but in that moment, with one sentence, I had given it back to them, heavier than they could bear. As I stepped into the night air, the cool wind brushing against my face, I felt not triumph, but release, a weight lifting from my chest that had pressed there for too long. I had shaken the table, not with my trembling hands, but with the truth they had hoped would remain buried. And for the first time in years, I walked, not as a man diminished, but as a man who had reclaimed his place, who had reminded his family, and himself, that his life, his home, and his dignity were not theirs to strip away. When I returned home that night, the house, which had so often felt like a tomb of silence, seemed for the first time in years to breathe again. I moved through the familiar rooms with a steadiness that surprised me, touching the backs of chairs, the worn edges of the table, the photographs of my wife on the walls, and it was as if they no longer accused me of loneliness but bore witness to my survival. For so long I had thought of myself as the frail old man my daughter had described, a figure tolerated at the edge of her table, a man whose place depended on his ability to remain small and quiet. But when I spoke that night, when I reminded her of the truth she had chosen to forget, I felt something shift inside me, something that had been buried under years of endurance. I was not erased. I was not finished. I still had a voice, and though it had cracked with age, it carried a force that silence could never match. The next morning, I kept my promise. I called my lawyer, a man I had known since the early years of my career, someone who still treated me with respect rather than pity, and I told him everything. We went over the documents, the deed, the accounts, and I instructed him to begin the process of withdrawing my daughter's access to anything that bore my name. There was a quiet efficiency in his voice, no surprise, no condescension, only the assurance that what I asked could and would be done. In his office, surrounded by shelves of thick legal books, I signed papers that placed my assets beyond her reach, redirecting them to places where they would serve others rather than enrich those who sought to diminish me. Some would go to a scholarship fund in my wife's name, some to the community center where I had spent afternoons playing chess with other men my age, and the rest would remain secured until the end of my days. For the first time in years, I walked out of a building not hunched beneath the weight of resignation, but upright, my hands trembling, yet my resolve unshaken. My daughter called me that evening, her voice unsteady, the confidence stripped from it. And though she tried to cloak her panic and concern, I heard the truth in every syllable. She asked if I had meant what I said, whether I was truly planning to sell the house, whether I understood how difficult that would make things for her family. I listened quietly, letting her words spill into the air, and when she finally asked if we could talk about it, I told her simply that there was nothing to discuss. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse her of betrayal. I did not list the humiliation she had inflicted upon me. I only told her that I had taken care of everything, and that from now on she need not worry about my affairs. There was a silence on the other end of the line, long and hollow, and then she said good night in a tone I had not heard in years, a tone stripped of authority. For the first time she sounded like the child again, uncertain, lost. I hung up the phone with no sense of triumph, only with a quiet, steady relief. In the days that followed, I discovered a new rhythm to my solitude. I no longer waited by the phone for her calls, no longer dressed in my best jacket in the hope of another dinner invitation. I began to cook for myself with more care, lingering over recipes my wife had loved, letting the scents fill the house the way they once had. I took walks not to pass the time, but to breathe, to notice the changing of the leaves, to feel the air on my face as something more than the passage of hours. At the park, I spoke more with the men who gathered there, sharing stories that were not cut short or dismissed, but listened to with the respect of equals. Slowly, the hollow ache that had lived inside me, fed by neglect and humiliation, began to soften. It did not vanish, for the wound my daughter left was too deep to close entirely, but it ceased to rule me. It became a scar instead of a bleeding cut. I do not know what the future holds for her, whether she will find in time the remorse she has not yet voiced, whether she will one day knock on my door, not with papers or corrections, but with genuine warmth. Perhaps she will, perhaps she will not. What I do know is that my life no longer hangs in the balance of her recognition. I have reclaimed myself, and in that reclamation I have found a kind of peace I did not think possible at my age. The trembling of my hands remains, the slowing of my body is inevitable, but these things no longer shame me. They are proof that I have lived, that I have endured, that I have survived both time and betrayal. My daughter may see in them weakness, but I know now they are strength, the strength of a man who refuses to be erased. And so, each evening when I sit at my own table, scarred and imperfect, I let the glass rattle as I set it down, and I listen to the sound with something close to pride. It is the sound of a life that still has a weight, of a presence that cannot be dismissed, of a man who shook not just a table, but the illusion that he was powerless. In that sound, I hear my wife's laughter, my younger self's determination, and the quiet promise that though my days may be numbered, they will not be wasted in silence. I will leave this world not as a burden diminished at someone else's table, but as a man who carried his dignity to the very end.